coming back to this symposium, as I said, the second half is different. It's a different one, more on a legal way. And the best expert to guide this part will be my colleague, organizer, Mr. Glenn Today, Chancellor of the University of Aruba, who is going to attend you now.
Thank you, Armand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've been enjoying the symposium up to now. We're going to move to the second half of this part. And please allow me to give a short introduction to the next speaker. Shortly after Aruba achieved its status aparte, discussions started about the way Parliament of Aruba functions. Members of Parliament appeared not to be focused on the interests of the Aruban community, but rather on those of the minister or the Council of Ministers and their political party. Parliament of Aruba should supervise government and design national laws on behalf of the Aruban community. Constitutionally, the most important role of Parliament is to be the one body that represents the whole community of Aruba. Did and do members of Parliament fulfill this function in line with this important constitutional duty? It does not show often, as debates about personal and party interests are the norm. Consequently, a large part of the Aruban community considered and still consider Parliament as a dysfunctional body, apparently acting more in line with private interests in the traditions of bad government. In our society, the qualification stempel parliament, a stamping parliament, is often used to qualify this. Many opportunities to practice good governance have been missed and are missed because of this improper focus. So we do hope on a shift. And this means that in order to realize good public governance, a radical transformation in the behavior of the members of Parliament and thus of the functioning of Parliament, that is a prerequisite. We asked the fraction leaders of the two largest political parties in Aruba that have been up to now determining the workings of Parliament what concrete actions they would take in order to make Parliament function more adequately. We are very happy that the fraction leader of the largest coalition party in Parliament was willing to accept this challenge. And please join me in welcoming Mr. Rocco Tjon to the podium.
His Excellency, the Governor of Aruba, Mr. Boekhout, His Excellency, President of Aruban's Parliament, Mr. Adi Thijssen, Her Excellency, Prime Minister of Aruba, Mrs. Evelien Wever-Kroes, other ministers, Member of Parliaments, and this very impressive crowd, good evening. I would like to thank the organization of the Foundation Quality Governance Aruba for inviting me and having me speak tonight on Parliament's role when it comes to promoting good governance. I just learned that I'm part of a dysfunctional body, and according to the survey conducted by the Central Bank of Aruba, we contribute to over 50% of corruption, so there's a lot of work for us to do. Now, all jokes aside, I'm very honored to be standing here tonight and be able to address this impressive crowd because I think this is a very important subject matter. My presentation, I have 15 minutes to address this, and the content of my presentation, I will have a brief introduction. Afterwards, I'll talk briefly about good governance, briefly what the literature states about good governance, because I think this is very important, because what I might consider good governance, someone else might not consider good governance. Afterwards, I'll talk about specifically 4 initiatives that Parliament undertook to promote good governance. And finally, I'll talk briefly about recent developments within the Kingdom of the Netherlands when it comes to good governance. As I already mentioned, and Mr. Today also mentioned this, Parliament's role is already anchored in the Constitution. But besides this, I still chose to illustrate Parliament's role with regards to promoting good governance by using statements out of 3 very important documents, which are the WODC report, which is an investigative report on the state of good governance in Aruba. I also would like to accentuate a policy report that specifically addresses if good governance is a national responsibility or a kingdom responsibility. And last but not least, I will like to illustrate the importance that the current government puts towards good governance, and this is anchored in the government program Junto pa Aruba. If we look at the WODC report, a Parliament's role is explicitly mentioned, and they specify that good governance depends on well-functioning of institutions that supervise the executive power, like Parliament, the National Advisory Council, the Court of Auditors, and also the Internal Auditing Service. Furthermore, one of their conclusions was that when members of Parliament noted legal infractions, they did not undertake action. So this emphasizes the important role that Parliament has when it comes to promoting good governance. If we look at the policy document I was referring to, which specifically, if we can still remain on the previous slide, please. If we look at the policy document I was mentioning, where they specifically address the difference between good governance being a national matter or a kingdom matter, if we read the explanatory memorandum on this law, we know that they mention that good governance in the first place is a national matter and that the kingdom has a supervisory task. And they emphasize this, that collaboration is essential when it comes to good governance within the kingdom. And that's also the reason why on the interparliamentary platform IPCO, we still have a committee that attends these issues. And why I mention this is because in 2014, fact is that Aruba went under supervision due to lack of good governance. And that's why I still wanted to illustrate this, that in the first place, it's a national matter. Last but not least, as I mentioned, in the government program, Junto pa Aruba, good governance is one of the key priorities of the Aruban government. And as a member of parliament, which obviously supports the current government, it's important for us to take note what's written in this government program, because we need to supervise developments within this program. Specifically, the government program talks, when it comes to good governance, about reinforcement of our democratic state by ensuring that institutions that have a supervisory task function well. And furthermore, they specifically mention the role of the parliament in controlling the government. Now that we know that parliament has a crucial role when it comes to contributing to good governance, I would like to go to the next slide and talk a bit about what good governance is. And I don't want it to be a lecture, but since the subject matter is very broad, I think it's important to briefly accentuate what most of the literature indicates when it comes to good governance. And as a member of parliament, again, I think this is very important for us as well, because it guides us in the initiatives that we take, and it also helps us to remain sane in this crazy world of politics. As I mentioned, good governance is not a clear-cut topic, and there are numerous definitions. However, all the definitions emphasize 3 aspects, and I think all of them were mentioned by the previous speakers. Good governance always talks about transparency, integrity, and accountability. Government governance arose from corporate governance, and corporate governance is a system, according to the literature, which companies use to direct and control their processes, a system of checks and balances. And I wanted to illustrate this because when it comes to the government, most of the critics always mention that it's a very bureaucratic system. We want a system that is very efficiently. However, this is also oxymoronic because on one hand, we want a system that is filled with checks and balances, but on the other hand, we want a system that is very efficient and makes sure that all petitions are handled within days. And that's not always possible. As I mentioned, government governance arose from corporate governance, and when we look at the definition of government governance, it is here, according to the literature, that good governance also came into, they started to talk about good governance. There are 6 aspects, and I only wanted to address 3 of these aspects because they also have raakvlak, as we say in Dutch, with the initiatives that Parliament is undertaking right now. They talk about a minimum state, which emphasizes that the government's role should be limited, and according to this vision, governance is the acceptable phase of spending cuts. The term good governance arose from government governance, as I mentioned, and is defined as the exercise of political power to manage a nation's affair with a minimum of institutional, legal, and political involvement. And last, they characterize good governance, good government governance, as a social cybernetic system. And I will address this in my final slide, when I also will briefly talk about my personal experience when it comes to good governance as a member of parliament. If we look at the Parliament's initiatives on the next slide, there are 4 that I would like to address tonight and briefly explain what they entail. And the Prime Minister already mentioned legislation on screening of ministers and members of Parliament, and legislation on financing of political parties. And these 2 initiatives specifically address the integrity aspect of good governance, because the main goal of these initiatives is to reduce integrity risks. And last year, a member of parliament, Mr. Edgard Vrolijk, who's also here, took it upon him to present an initiative law which regulates the screening of ministers and members of parliament. And the main goal, as I mentioned, of this initiative law is to ensure the integrity of ministers, which stimulates good governance, integrity, and transparency within the government. This law can be seen as an instrument to decrease integrity risks, and it basically provides a legal basis, if I can put it like that, to dig deeper into financial and judicial background of any candidate to become a minister, but not only of the candidate, also of his or her partner. So it's a law, obviously, that needs to have also its checks and balances because it goes very far. However, we do believe that it's necessary. Another law that was an initiative law from Mr. Vrolijk is legislation on financing of political parties. And we believe it is fundamental to the democratic process that it is not influenced by sponsors or moneylenders. We believe it's beneficial to democracy that financing of political parties is well regulated, even if it is only to take away the impression that the political process is being influenced. A well-regulated system can once again stimulate good governance by enforcing transparency. And the proposed law will not only have an effect on political parties, but also on political candidates. And it takes all aspects into account, such as fundraising events, foundations, and also gifts. So it imposes a great responsibility on all political candidates, as they would have to register all gifts that they receive, and in order to impede that donations or gifts are being donated through a firm or another entity, a UBO declaration will also be mandatory. Parliament's proposal, the third bullet point, this was a proposal during the public meeting of 2018, and it had to do with our financial situation. during a lot of meetings that we had with, among others, the CAFT, they always mentioned that they only supervise on a macro level. And that's the reason why a lot of, let me put it like that, unrealistic numbers that were presented were not, they did not notice those unrealistic numbers. So as one of the supervisory institutions also, as Parliament, we thought it's very important to come with a proposal that was accepted by Parliament, to have the government come and explain halfway throughout the year how they are executing the approved resources by means of statistics, realistic statistics. So we had, in Dutch we call it uitputtingscijfers, of each department within the government to make sure that they were not overspending what was approved. And the reason why we did this also was because in 2017 we were confronted with the fact that we had to approve additional resources. And that's why we think this is very important, and we understood that it was for the first time in the history of Parliament that this initiative was being undertaken. So this is also what we will continue to do for this year's budget, which we approved last December, but halfway throughout this year, the government will also again come to Parliament, because if it's necessary to adapt, we want to do that halfway throughout the year and not at the end of the year. Reinforcement of the supervisory institutions, I think the Prime Minister addressed that. There's a committee that is presided by the President of Parliament, Mr. Tjon, which will oversee that this year all supervisory institutions will be completely independent from government. Because even for the financial aspects, all these supervisory institutions still depend on the government. And I think not only for the financial aspect, but also for the aspect, if they want to recruit employees for the respective institutions, this has to be, it has to be able that these institutions can do it by themselves. Last but not least, the last slide, the road to good governance. This is not one of the roads in Aruba, but the road to good governance, I believe, is a road that is under construction. I mentioned that one of the definitions of good governance, good government governance, is that they define it as a social cybernetic system. And this describes government governance as the result of interactions between political, social, and administrative actors. And I still would like to emphasize this, because often when we talk about good governance, we only look at the government, we look at Parliament, we look at the supervisory institutions, but I truly believe that we all have a very important role when it comes to good governance, and when it comes to promoting good governance. Because me, myself, for instance, as a politician, as a member of Parliament, every decision I take, I need to take into account internal factors. All the people that support our party, my fellow colleagues within Parliament, the ministers. As the Prime Minister mentioned, we're sometimes very critical when it comes to certain decisions that the government takes. But even so, if you're critical and you still agree with the government, the opposition will label you as being a stempel parliament. If you do not agree with the government, your own party will label you as being opposition within the coalition. So it's very important to understand this dynamic, because I truly believe that we all can contribute to promoting good governance on the island. And we all, and I heard the President of the Central Bank mention that we all should be watchdogs, and I agree with that. However, I believe just as everyone expects us politicians to be objective in our decisions, objective when it comes to promoting good governance, I think that's the same standard that we should set to each one of us. Because we all, including the media, the environment, but also all governmental departments, have a crucial role when it comes to good governance. I'm very optimistic. I think the plans that the government has laid out can truly contribute to re-establishing confidence within politics on the island, and I truly believe that it's a perfect roadmap to achieve good governance. And as a member of parliament, we obviously will contribute to that, but I truly believe, and I want to emphasize that before I close, that it's not only a task of the government or of parliament or one of the supervisory institutions, it's a task of us all. Thank you very much.